Hi, this is Debbie, and today I have a tutorial over at Altenew looking at some retro style stamping, and I'm going to share it here on my YouTube channel and blog as well. I'm going to be showing two examples, and I'm going to start with a simple flowers set and a selection of the Altenew crisp inks. I've got a piece of white card and I'm going to cut this down at the end, but I'm starting with an 8 1/4 by 4 inch piece of card, which is roughly 21 by 10 centimetres. In pencil, I've marked a grid of 3 squares, which are slightly larger than the images from the simple flowers set that I want to use, and then I'm using some blue painter's tape to mask off those squares. Initially I'm going to be working on the outer 2 squares, and so I'm placing tape across the middle square so that I can create the 2 squares with tape all the way around for the outer 2 squares, and then later on I can remove that tape to work on the middle square. I'm now moving on to creating some masks for the images that I want to use. I've got a selection of the flowers and leaves from the Simple Flowers set, and I'm going to stamp those onto some post-it note. This is the type of post-it note that has adhesive over the whole piece. I've stamped all the images that I'm going to be using, and then I've trimmed around those, leaving just a small border around the outside. I'm then placing those masks where I want to eventually stamp the leaves and flowers. Again, I'm just working on the outside squares at the moment because the middle square is still covered by the tape, and I'll come back to that later. I'm going to be using a Ranger Mini Ink Blender to blend ink into the background of the left-hand square, but I'm not sure which colour to start with. I want a light grey, but I don't know whether Morning Frost is going to be too light or whether to use Evening Grey. So I've started with the Morning Frost, and as I'm blending ink into the background, I begin to realise that really it's probably not going to be dark enough for what I want, and so I've switched to Evening Grey. I'll continue to blend ink into that square, and as you can see, I've sped up the video. This does take a little bit of time. You're best off starting with a light covering of ink and slowly blending that in, and then deepening and deepening the colour till you get the colour that you would like, rather than going in with too much ink and getting it a bit splodgy. Having finished the blending of the left-hand square with the Evening Grey, I'm now moving on to using Warm Sunshine on the right-hand square. Again, working in light circles and making sure that I really get in between the 2 leaf images to get an even coverage over the whole of the background. Once I'd finished blending the outer squares, it was then time to remove the tape that was covering the middle square, and to do that, the best way to do it is to lift it gently and then pull back at a sharp angle. You want to keep the tape almost back on itself, if that makes sense, and this removes the tape with the minimum risk of it damaging the paper. Once I've removed both those middle strips, I could then lay new strips down to cover the outside edges of the middle square. And one thing I meant to mention before is that I'm making sure that I cover the pencil line so that this doesn't get trapped underneath the ink blending, which means that once all the ink blending is complete, I can then erase the pencil line. I've laid the mask down for the middle square, and this time I'm going to be using blush ink to blend into the background of the middle square. With the ink blending now finished, I can remove the painter's tape and erase the pencil lines. I'm using a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, which is like a pencil in structure, and it makes it easier to get into the smaller spaces. I'm leaving the post-it note masks in place, as that will help me to align the stamp to the post-it note mask so that I get the correct position in the space that I've allocated for the image. I can then remove the mask to stamp the flower, and for this first flower I'm going to go with Mountain Mist ink. I'm using the Misty Stamping Tool, which means I can re-ink and stamp this image several times until I get a really good impression. I use this technique for most of my stamping now, be it an outline image and I'm going to copy colour. I will stamp the image several times until I get a really nice black outline, or equally when you're using a solid image such as these flowers and leaves, it really makes it worthwhile to stamp them several times to get the best impression you can. Moving on to the middle square, and I'm going to stamp this flower in Caramel Toffee ink, and again I'm going to stamp it several times until I get a really good impression. Moving on to the final square on the right, and I'm going to stamp the first leaf in Frayed Leaf and then the second leaf in Evening Grey. For the sentiment, I've chosen the lovely large beautiful word from the Simple Flowers set, and I've lined that up so that it's going to span the right hand 2 squares, and then I'm stamping that in VersaFine Smoky Grey. I'm using the Tim Holtz trimmer, and I've slowly been taking off a little bit from each of the edges until I've got a panel which I feel has nice even space around the squares. I've left a little extra white space on the lower portion of the panel to account for the lovely looping F of the beautiful sentiment. After trimming, the panel is now roughly 7 5/8 by 3 3/4, which is 18.7 by 8.7 centimetres. I've added foam adhesive to the back of the panel and then mounted that onto a grey card base. To complete the sentiment for this card, I've blended some Mountain Mist ink into a scrap piece of white card. I'm then going to make sure it's fully dry before I move on to heat embossing the sentiment. I'm going to be using the "You're So" wording, which will then mean that the sentiment says "You're so beautiful." And as I'm going to heat emboss this, I'm using some EK Success powder tool to help prepare the card so that embossing powder doesn't stick where I don't want it to. I can then stamp the sentiment in a sticky embossing ink such as Versamark ink, and then sprinkle with white embossing powder before using a really hot heat tool to melt the embossing powder. I've trimmed the sentiment to size and then added foam adhesive to the back before adding it so that it sits above the beautiful word, so you get the full sentiment of "You're So Beautiful." Finally, I added a few sequins with Ranger Molten Medium and Matte to finish this first example of a retro style. I had great fun making this card, and so I wanted to make a second example, and I thought the Coffee Love set would be perfect. I've marked a grid of rectangles onto a white piece of card and then stamped the images from the Coffee Love set in a Copic friendly ink. I've then used the matching Coffee Love dies to cut masks from post-it note paper and then laid those over the top of the images. In the same way as before, I've then used blue painter's tape to mask off the rectangles, and then I've blended ink into the background of each of the rectangles. I've used blush ink for the left rectangle, Warm Sunshine for the right rectangle, and for the middle one I've used the Evening Grey. I've then removed all the painter's tape, erased the pencil lines, and then lifted the post-it note masks. For the sentiment, I've picked one from the Coffee Love set that spans nicely across the right two rectangles at the top of the rectangles, and I'm going to stamp those in VersaFine Onyx Black. I'm going to use some basic Copic colouring, and I've picked some colours which match the "You're So Beautiful" card, as I think all these colours of the two cards are toning so nicely together. I used E44 for the coffee pot, and then R12, PG11, G43 and YR12 for the cups and saucers. And I must admit, I did go in and add some W3 to the top of the coffee pot before I photographed this card, but I hadn't done it during the video. With the Copic colouring now finished, I foam mounted the panel onto a grey card base. And that completes this second example. I was really pleased how these two cards came together, and I really like that retro look. I'll leave links to the products I used in the YouTube description below, along with a link to my coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I would be delighted if you think about subscribing to this channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.